You mentioned another key thing, which is the location of Atlantis according to Plato, which was of course beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is the modern Gibraltar. And we know that from other sources that what was that Greeks called Hercules Pillars was actually the Strait of Gibraltar, and Plato mentioned that it was beyond it or in front of it, depending on the translation,
That's
which shows us that it was beyond the Mediterranean. And even as you mentioned, Plato says even more about it, that there is something beyond what we call the ocean, and that there is some land that is surrounding this huge body of water, which when we actually switch the map and we look from the perspective, if we were sailing, for example, from the Straits of Gibraltar beyond to the Atlantic Ocean, which is also the same name as Atlantis, we've got Atlantic Ocean, Atlas Mountains in the north of Africa, and we see that the Americas, both Americas, North and South, with of course the Middle Americas, actually show us a continent that surrounds the Atlantic Ocean. We've got only places to leave this ocean at the north and at the south. So this is a very interesting detail which can show us that Plato had knowledge beyond the knowledge of what we know Greeks knew about the geography of the world, because the Greeks were actually limited. We know a few maps which show their worldview about how the world looked like. They knew about, of course, only the south of Europe, north of Africa, and a bit of Asia, and this was their world. And Plato here in his two dialogues show us that there is something beyond, which is also an interesting point against the skeptics who say, oh, Plato's story of Atlantis was a story, for instance, of the eruption of the Terra volcano on the Mediterranean Sea. But Plato uses completely different language. He isn't saying that it is on the Mediterranean Sea, but he says that it is beyond the Mediterranean, on the ocean.
This is
Oceanos.
Oceanos, exactly. And he even says, to contradistinguish the Mediterranean from the Atlantic, he says our sea is but like an inland sea. It's like a lake. It's like a large lake, you know? So he was absolutely aware of the physical boundaries of the Mediterranean. And then beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, the true ocean can be reached, wherein lies Atlantis, and beyond it, a continent that surrounds the true sea. So again, what you just said is so important. How did a Greek philosopher living in Athens in 360 BC know about North America? How? How did he know that? You know, I include a really funny interview where a Washington Post, I think, reporter in the 80s went to the Azores just to do a tourist, you know, like a Frommer's guide for which bars and things to go to. And he said in the cab driver in the Azores, he brought this up. And the guy said to him, well, I mean, you know, pre-internet, he said, well, I don't know anything about Atlantis. And he says, you're on the mountain peaks of Atlantis. And he pulled out the dialogues of Plato and he says, look, how did Plato know about America? And the guy says, wait, Plato knew about America? I never read that, you know, and I don't think a lot of people know this, you know, and I think it's important because it's not that Plato knew or had direct knowledge of North America. It's that Solon was in touch with the Egyptians, who I would argue are a remnant colony of Atlantis, and they preserved that knowledge, you know, and later there's a lot of evidence that the Phoenicians, thousands of years before Columbus, had actually reached parts of, say, Brazil, and possibly even North America. And how did they have these maps and this knowledge of the true ocean? Well, probably because they themselves were a remnant colony, maritime civilization that had preserved either physical maps, like the Piraeus map or its source map, perhaps, or direct knowledge of this. And so these are incredibly difficult things to explain if, again, you're writing a foundational myth or some sort of allegory. I think a lot of times people think, well, Plato wrote the allegory of the caves. And yeah, well, it's called the allegory of the cave and it's disclaimed as an allegory.
And I think it's really kind of unfortunate that Atlantis has been wrapped up as this, allegory or even myth, when in fact Plato was describing, sixth hand, but to the best of his ability, itself a fragment of a much bigger story that Plato's story itself was just but the ending of. And so I think what's so exciting about this show, and what we'll get a chance to do, is, go all the way back, using remote viewing, using kind of deduction, using pre-Platonic sources, and seeing how they align to show, well, how did the civilization even emerge? And how did it get to the point of this final destruction that Plato himself described?